I'm just intrigued. What inspired you to focus on such a broad topic for a start, and a topic that may benefit the community current and future?
I feel like growing up in an environment in which I saw a clear need for mental health support and clear gaps in accessibility is what initially piqued my interest in a career focused on mental health and psychology and healing.
Hello and welcome to Ph.D. Hard Talk. How are you, Robyn?
Hi, Noma. I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me today. I'm excited to speak with you.
Excellent. I'm excited to talk to you about your research because I think it's just amazing. Could you please introduce your research to the world?
Absolutely. So broadly, I would say my research investigates the unique vulnerabilities and also strengths of underserved trauma-exposed youth. So regarding vulnerabilities, my work has examined the experiences of Black and Brown youth and youth who are low income and how they've been exposed to traumatic grief in various ways, whether it's the loss of loved ones, being exposed to community violence, such as exposure to gang activity or shootings, racial or poverty-related trauma. And so those are really the vulnerabilities that I'm interested in. But I also believe that we need more research that's focused on the strengths of underserved youth, right? Like we all come from communities that have been through traumatic or stressful events. And so I'm really interested in how youth who are underserved pull from their communities to gain resiliency. And so I'm also interested in factors such as community engagement or community-based healing practices as protective factors for resiliency. So that can include how youth are able to mobilize their resources in times of stress, mutual aid efforts, taking care of each other, and how youth benefit from connections within their communities. So all of those aspects of the unique experiences that underserved youth have, whether they're racially oppressed, class oppressed, religiously oppressed, whatever, they're all exposed to traumatic stress and cope with traumatic stress in unique and nuanced ways. And so I'm really interested in both quantitative and qualitative ways to answering questions about how we can invest more resources into the healing of communities that need it.
Okay, excellent. So, I'm just intrigued. What inspired you to focus on, such a broad topic for a start, and interesting, and a topic that may benefit the community current and future?
That's a great question. I think it was a mixture of things. Going as early back to my childhood, I grew up in a low-income neighborhood in America, in Texas specifically. And I feel like growing up in an environment in which I saw a clear need for mental health support and clear gaps in accessibility is what initially piqued my interest in a career focused on mental health and psychology and healing. I was exposed to many distinct societal factors that can play a role in how underserved communities respond to traumatic stress and grief, whether it's being exposed to community stressors, right? Having disparities in health responses, diminished lifespans, whether it's, the intersections of experiencing gendered oppression, racial oppression, poverty-related oppression, all these different things. And so I also noticed that following traumatic stress in low-income communities, our community's coping practices were often related to community care and kinship support, right? So because we don't maybe have access to as many places to get mental health support or to get financial resources, we typically pull from each other. And while those coping strategies really highlight the strength and resiliency of underserved groups, I also think it does a disservice to communities who support exclusively comes from mutual aid due to a lack of access to other mental health treatments. So I think that's what really inspired me to go into the field myself and to research and advocate for different ways that oppressed communities can get access to what they need. And so that's really what inspired me to devote my career to finding sociocultural and class-conscious treatments, particularly for childhood trauma and grief, because as we know, developmentally, the sooner that we can get youth who've been exposed to traumatic stress help and support, the higher the likelihood that they will have positive mental health outcomes once they reach adulthood. So as I grew up and as I decided to pursue an education, I went and got my undergraduate degree in psychology. And there's when I first got my experience related to community-based research. I then went on to get my master's in counseling because I'm also really interested in therapy and intervention work for differently oppressed communities. And recently I started my Ph.D. in clinical psychology here in Texas. And my mentor, her name is Noni Gaylord-Hardin. Her work focuses a lot on the different coping skills, the different strengths, resiliency factors, and vulnerabilities of youth, particularly Black youth and other underserved youth. So really it's been like a whole life kind of thing, and really it's been pushed along by my passion for continuing to ask questions and just be curious about why these disparities exist, how people are coping with them, and what we can do to make access more accessible.
In terms of, you know, the current situation of your research, are you focusing on Texas or are you focusing on, you know, the United States as a whole?
You know, it's a really important question. In the most recent publication that I was able to put out, we access data through a trauma and grief center in Houston, Texas. So all of that data collection was done in Texas. However, as I'm working with different mentors who, you know, have different connections in different states, we've been talking about how location, geographic location, can also play a large role in what people have access to, right, and what they're exposed to. And so that's why I think collaborating is such a wonderful and exciting part of research. So we're now trying to reach out to different states where there are academics and clinicians that are also passionate about that work, so that we can expand data collection and really be able to run analysis to look at geographical differences in exposure and resiliency. So that's in the works right now.
Excellent. So I know that currently there's been a movement in terms of, you know, the LGBTQ community, and in terms of trans. I'm not sure if I'm using the politically correct terms, but I know that, you know, there's a movement in the US specifically. So, and I believe, based again on watching documentaries and reading around, that, you know, the age group is no longer from above 21. It can start even from a young age of 4, for example. Are you also incorporating that into your research? Because they face trauma as well, and some of them do come from brown backgrounds, be it Asian, be it Black, etc., Hawaiian, etc. I mean, you know, there's a lot of groups in terms of that. So, you know, does your research focus on that trauma as well, or is it mainly you know, the day-to-day kind of trauma? And I'll explain what day-to-day when you've answered.
Absolutely. You know, I really love that you brought up what it must be like to live at the intersections of, you know, being gender diverse and also potentially being a person of color, or living in a neighborhood and where there are disparities in terms of what you have access to. And that's one reason that I really look to through a multidisciplinary lens when I'm doing my research, and I pull from different theories such as intersectionality with Kimberly Crenshaw, who says that, you know, people who exist at these intersections of oppressed identities, even though she started with looking at being Black and being a woman, that can also expand to being trans, right? And being a person of color, being trans, and being from an oppressed class. Living at those intersections, we found research that shows that can really exacerbate the amount of stress that is put on one's mental health, one's physical health, one's community health. And so while it's something that we kind of are able to capture in demographic info, we typically have space for, you know, youth to enter what is your gender identity, you know, and all of these different things, your sexual preferences and things like that. I do believe that people who come from those communities really are doing the work of figuring out how to best incorporate and center trans communities and queer communities in their work. And so I think what is the most interesting, important for me is to let people who do that work specifically take the lead on ensuring that, you know, we are capturing the experiences of those groups accurately. And I want to do my best to support that and to advocate for that in any way that I can. Because my work is more focused on the intersections of racial identity and poverty, I will say, like, that's more at the forefront of what I've published thus far. But I do read a lot of work from communities that are queer or LGBTQ, who are also doing work about their trauma exposure, because I think it's very important to really inform all of our research when we're looking at underserved communities. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that I think that those people should really be at the forefront of the work that they are doing to serve their communities. And myself as a cisgendered woman, I want to do what I can to support and uplift their message, whether it's collaborating with them, helping to increase the access to whatever they need to disseminate their research, and really just to support. So I think that's a really great question.
Well, thank you. So I guess going back to the day-to-day, you know, issues that brown people or people in poverty do face, religion is usually at the forefront. You know, and it comes with a lot of trauma. You know, when you later on in your adulthood, when you're younger, you don't necessarily see, or if you're new to the religion, whether you're older, you don't see that you're going through some oxymorons. I'll put it that way. You only realize later. So is that, you know, a fragment of your research, or you haven't focused on that? And why haven't you, if you haven't? Because I think that's really important.
I completely agree with you. So one of my research mentors runs a trauma and grief center in Texas. Her name is Julie Kaplow, Dr. Julie Kaplow. And she also collects data on the religious experiences of youth. Typically, when youth are involved with a trauma and grief center, both the youth will do assessments with their consent, but also their parents, right? So their parents may be able to answer more questions about, you know, the nuanced aspects of the youth's identity, what religion their family identifies by, how that really interplays in how they cope and their resiliency. And we are collecting some data from youth themselves about, you know, what are they using as coping skills, which can include their religion. So I think as we gather more data about people's religious identities and how that plays a role in how they cope with traumatic stress, or how that can exacerbate traumatic stress, kind of like what you were talking about, how that plays a role, I think that's definitely going to be something that we try to ingrain more in our research papers. Thus far, I've only published one paper so far, but that's definitely something that we're actively collecting data on and that we're looking at in the future as well.
So, okay, let me play devil's advocate. If your findings reveal that, you know, religion is actually the worst thing ever in life and it causes a lot of trauma, what advice would you give individuals that are seeking, because, you know, based again on research and reading, individuals from ethnic minority backgrounds aren't so keen to go to a therapist and have a conversation. They would rather go to religion and believe in a higher power. Now, what tends to happen, again, I come from a psychology background, is that the milestones, you know, they're not really in place. Then they have a breakdown later on. But then again, when it comes to mental health, in these groups again, it's not something that's taken with respect. It's, you know, it can be seen, you know, disrespected with banter, to put it that way. Sometimes it can be respected, you know, not to say, you know, there isn't a balance, but, you know, there is an imbalance in that sense. So what are your thoughts in terms of that?
No, I really appreciate the perspective and the way that you worded that question. I think what I have been reading up more, particularly from clinicians and therapists, as well as academics, but mostly from people who, you know, practice therapy, is that when a lot of times when they're working with youth or communities that often pull from their religion in order to be resilient. Oftentimes that can be because they don't have access to a lot of other resources, or maybe they don't trust mental health services because of, experiences in the past or historically that have made them, doubt or be unsure about whether mental health services can actually be effective for them. So I think one of the most important things when working with communities that, solely say, they don't need mental health services, they'll just pull from their religion, is just to kind of let them know that, you can do both, right? You can have your religion, you can have your beliefs, but you can also receive mental health support. And there are wonderful academics and clinicians out there who do work specifically focused on religious-based therapeutic interventions. So I think you can be respectful of people's beliefs, but also ingrain in them some practical mental health resources and support that can allow them to ingrain both in a healthy way and in a holistic way. So I think, there has to be a bit of nuance regarding, just focusing on religion is a bad thing versus just focusing on mental health treatment is a bad thing. Sometimes people can just meet in the middle and use both, and that works for them as well.
Yeah. So in your own opinion, would you advise and say, try and do both before you kick the other one out? Or would you say stick to what you know best? Because, clinicians, as you've said, they've been trained. And then this brings me to a point. I think I'm a little bitter. It's social media. We have our influencers. They do say a lot when it comes to mental health, but they've never been trained. And they've read online maybe a few lines on a theory, and they will go off on a tangent on how amazing it is and how it's changed their lives, and people buy into that. So that's what I'm trying to get to here, to say it can be a problem, because you're doing the research and you've looked at the data, the raw data that is, and you've looked at your findings and you've drawn conclusions, so you know what the actual reality is, rather than reading one paper. You're being a scientist, you're reading broadly in that sense. So what's your opinion in terms of what I've just touched on there?
My opinion in terms of people who tout that, focusing on religion is the way to go versus ingraining other mental health treatments. Is that kind of what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. For me, what I found to be really humbling in my experience as an academic, when working with communities, is to first, without judgment, just kind of listen to where they're coming from, to get an idea of where those ideas may have, become ingrained in their cognitive processing of how we should be coping with stress, right? It's really just like coming from an observation mindset of like, okay, this is what you believe. I may not agree with it on a personal level, but just as a therapist, a clinician, or as an academic, just coming from a place of curiosity, right? And asking, where do we get those messaging or those ideas that we can only pull from one source in order to work towards healing? And from there, again, just coming from a curious mindset, just kind of working curiously to process those experiences with that person. I'm more talking from like a clinician mindset. I think it's really interesting that you're asking from an academic mindset as well. Yeah, I think I'm just still kind of stuck in a place of like, I may not believe that to necessarily be true. And I can publish my own work or do my own research to kind of, come with data and with what others have found to sort of educate people. But at the end of the day, I also think we can learn from people who have varying different experiences and opinions on healing than we do, right? And so I think working from a curious mindset of hearing what their experiences are, and then using that to also inform my work and my psychoeducation is what I'm mostly interested in, even if I don't necessarily agree.
Okay, love that. So going back to social media and the influencers, like I did touch on how they share information, and they'll say, if you do this, get into yoga, it will help you. But they don't know the ins and outs of that person's day to day in terms of their stresses, their triggers, and the trauma that they've actually gone through. And sometimes they do open up, you'll find a YouTube video just as we're filming for like 40 minutes. Someone will open up and say, this is what I've done and it helped me. What's your opinion on that? Because I'm just thinking they don't have the certificates. It's like me, and you come to me and you say, I've got a headache. And I'm like, okay, this is a prescription. It worked for me. Take it.
Absolutely.
What's your opinion? I mean, hopefully we won't get any backlash in terms of this, but disclaimers are opinions, so deal with it.
No, absolutely. And I think today, with people staying home more in the midst of a pandemic, people are really looking for a catch-all approach of how to overcome trauma, right? Or how to cope with stress. And for people who don't have access to mental health support that is individualized specifically for them, we may see people online following lots of different mental health pages, right? Or holistic wellness pages. And there can be some value in that. There are some wonderful pages that are, run by people with lived experiences, and they just talk about what has worked for them in particular, or they're licensed clinicians and they've talked about what they've learned based off of evidence-based practices. And I think those can be very helpful because they're accessible. But at the same time, I agree with you in that it also leaves this space for people who don't have any lived experiences or any expertise to come and make their own pages, and to use that as an opportunity to just put forth their opinions about what healing should be. And so I think it's really important for people out there who are following these wellness pages just to do a little bit of research about, if you see something on a page that is focused on wellness and you don't necessarily agree with it or it doesn't sit right with you, you can just recognize that maybe this isn't the right resource for me. I think you should go with your gut and really just focus on pages that are aligned with your own interest and your own forms of healing and wellness, and really go from there. I wish there was an easier answer, but I think there's always going to be people who tout themselves as being experts, right? When really they don't have any expertise. And so I think we all just kind of have to be careful and then do our own research and come to our own conclusions about what works best for us. But always people with lived experiences or expertise, whether they're clinicians or academics or therapists, are pages that I think are really nice resources. And they don't just have to be one page. You can follow 20 pages and they may all have different opinions. You integrate that and ingrain that in your own life in a way that feels sustaining and helpful for you.
Excellent. So going back to your research then, you did mention that your approach was quantitative and qualitative. I mean, I think that's a difficult task. So could you please take us through that choice and why would you go for quantitative and qualitative?
No, I love both approaches. So a little bit about the recent research paper that I published. I was really interested in how underserved youth are differentially exposed with trauma and loss differently than youth who may have more resources, right? So I published an article with a few of my research mentors and colleagues on disparities in maladaptive grief for Black and Latino youth and youth who live amongst neighborhood disadvantage. Maladaptive grief, which is something that so many of us are navigating right now during the pandemic, is basically prolonged or dysfunctional thoughts or behaviors that occur when someone has lost a loved one. So that's something that a lot of youth are coping with right now. And neighborhood disadvantaged youth are youth who face community level stressors on a daily basis, whether it's living amongst high poverty rates or having below standard housing. So really, I was really passionate about listening to the narratives and the stories, and also just, getting data and having conversations with these youth who are underserved about their experiences with trauma and grief. So our aim for this paper was strictly quantitative. So at a trauma and grief center with trained clinicians, youth were given assessments and on their experiences related to their trauma and loss. But our broader aim was to really explore childhood trauma and grief disparities in the context of racial or ethnic or neighborhood disparities. So enabled to test whether known disparities experienced by these groups could play a role in mental health outcomes. The way we were able to do that was through assessment data specifically. So amongst our population, a couple of our findings were that Latino youth tended to report a higher maladaptive grief, right? So having a harder time coping with the loss of loved ones. Youth who resided in disadvantaged communities in general also reported higher maladaptive grief symptoms. And also Black youth reported higher maladaptive grief and post-traumatic stress symptoms compared to other youth. And so that association between their grief and their trauma experiences was also partially explained by having the increased likelihood of losing a loved one to homicide and also being exposed to multiple traumatic events. So even though this particular paper only utilized quantitative data, we also discussed how this really signals a need for future research that can explore disparities in trauma and grief experiences in a more nuanced way. And I think qualitative research and community-based research are really wonderful ways of getting to those nuanced experiences of youth in their own words, right? And not just an assessment that may have been normed for a population that is different from them, but also just kind of having general conversations, looking at overall themes and coding for that is something that I'm really interested in pursuing more in the future.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And I'm glad that you've gone through the findings in terms of the different brown groups there and explained how trauma does affect one. And, you know, the repercussions, you know, you wouldn't sit down with one person and watch them for 20 years, unfortunately.
Yes.
But, you know, I think your research is doing a really, really good job so that we understand ourselves individually. So high five to Houston. So, in terms of the next steps then, are you thinking of ethnographic research for when you start publishing by yourself and, you know, when you've graduated and observing individuals, where are you in your mind?
Absolutely. You know, I've always been interested in the intersections of looking at both quantitative ways of collecting data, but also qualitative ways. And so a couple of things that I'm hoping to do throughout my research program are to start doing focus groups with oppressed youth, the youth of color, low-income youth, just hearing in their own words what their experiences are and working with them so that, you know, as an academic, I'm not just benefiting from what youth are telling me, but also working within communities so that it's a mutually beneficial relationship. Which is what community-based participatory action research is all about, right? It's like, this work isn't just for researchers to publish and then say, bye, see you later. It's for us to work in collaboration with communities with the mutual respect and just kind of come together. I think that there is like this really clear line that kind of exists today between academia and community work. And I think that really does a disservice to both of those communities, but especially to communities in general, when academics don't do everything that they can to ensure that their work is actually benefiting the communities that they are studying. And so the more that I can work face-to-face with communities and hear what they're saying, ingrain their work, and also support them, I think the better. So I'm hoping that that works out. I did not expect to start a PhD program in the middle of a global pandemic, so that makes it really hard. But you know, with things like Zoom and online interviewing, we're coming up with innovative ways to still do that work.
Excellent. I love your explanation. You know, that's why, you know, we've got project dissemination, is to get this back to the community so they understand why we are spending 4, maybe 8 years of our lives, you know, reading books and, you know, playing with numbers, essentially.
Exactly.
So, you know, you've just made it make sense with your response there. So thank you for that.
Of course.
In terms of, you know, the youth, if we look at Texas, right? I'm playing the devil's advocate. Why not look at the trauma that the middle class and upper class face, because you know, as much money does not make anybody happy, I think we've all understood that subject. You know, from day one, we know the assignment with that one. But if you were to look at them, because I would like to think in Texas, you know, you've got the groups as well, just as we all do globally, because I think they do go through trauma. Just again,
absolutely,
on research, because some of them, they never see their parents, and that is just trauma. To say, I've got all the money in the world, but the one person that I want to say hi to genuinely doesn't have time for me. But don't you think that would be fun and exciting to compare the trauma? Maybe not fun, but it would be interesting.
I definitely do. I love that you brought that up. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk more about that. Because there definitely do exist important like disparities and nuances and the differences between, you know, youth who come from more of an underserved background compared to youth who may come from, you know, a little bit more resources, but have still been exposed to trauma. So in this current paper that I published at the Trauma and Grief Center, we saw kids from all different walks of life, right? Kids who came from households where they had more resources, kids who were coming from backgrounds where they had very little and they were living in a scarcity kind of environment. And in the current paper, while we did look at disparities between those different groups, our outcomes showed that the, you know, underserved youth were showing higher reports of these different factors. But that, again, does not mean that youth who have more resources did not report any trauma symptoms or did not report grief symptoms. They all did, right? And typically what we find is that youth who go to trauma and grief treatment centers, who go to community centers or mental health centers or hospitals for support, tend to be youth who come from families that have a little more resources. So typically when we're looking at papers regarding the trauma and grief outcomes for youth, they are typically, if you look at the participant data, they tend to be youth who have more resources because those are the ones that can go to trauma and grief centers, you know. So that research is definitely out there, and that's definitely something that I tend to look at further in my research. But I think that there are amazing people who are currently doing that work. And while my main interest is underserved youth, I completely agree with you that youth in general are suffering and dealing with so many difficult things today. And I really want my work dissemination to not come from like a separationist mindset, but really to say all youth are dealing with really stressful things, and this is how we can treat all youth in these really wonderful ways. But underserved youth in particular might be dealing with these different systemic types of stress. And so just kind of exploring that a bit more.
Exciting. So in terms of your next steps then, I know that you're publishing and I know that, you know, you're still in university. Are you already looking ahead to say, I want to do a postdoc, you know, be a professor one day, or I want to work with the policy writers through research, or just go and work, you know, in industry and do marketing or finance or whatever I want to do? Where are you? Where are you mentally?
Well, working in industry sometimes is tempting. I'm like, wow, they make so much more money than me as a doctoral student right now. But I'm very happy with my choice. So I will say, you know, currently I'm a first year doctoral student. And these programs typically last in America between like 4 to 7 years. So I'm really hoping that at least within the next 5 years after I've graduated with my PhD, that I can secure a research postdoc in particular that allows me to, you know, focus on community-based participatory action research studies so that I can more accurately center the experiences of underserved youth, but also to ingrain some clinical work in that as well so that I can create or work on more accessible, class-conscious, culturally informed mental health assessments and interventions for youth. So right now, I'm still really interested in finding a way to do both clinical work and research, and also advocacy. So like a third area, and a postdoc that allows me to ingrain all three would be completely ideal. But you know, I think at this point, I'm going to be a researcher for the rest of my life. So I see that really being at the forefront of everything I do because it's been so amazing.
No, I think, do you know what? Being an advocate, you communicate effectively, and I think you would be able to, to get the points across for everybody to understand. You're not pompous, so it makes sense. And I'm enjoying our discussion, so I'm like, go for
Me too.
it. Literally. So, in terms of PhD hard talk, then I came out of the blue and I was like, hi, you were like, hey. I was like, can you come on PhD hard talk? What made you say yes? I want to go on PhD hard talk.
Yeah, so when you first approached me, it made me feel so excited at the opportunity to connect with, another researcher, another academic from a different part of the world who was also really passionate about research dissemination and that work. I felt a little nervous because, I'm still gaining experience with research communication skills. But when I looked up your work, you sent me your videos, I saw how kind and inviting you were, and I listened to your passion for academia just in general. I thought, wow, this seems like a really safe and affirming space to discuss research, to share experiences, and hopefully to reach others who see themselves in the work that we do, and also to increase accessibility in science communication in the field. Like we've talked about, like this boundary that exists between academia and the community, I think is kind of like a disservice, especially today when things are becoming more accessible. So I love that the purpose of your show is to increase accessibility. So I was really happy to be involved, and I'm glad I came. It's been great.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your kind words. I guess we've come to the end, but before we close off, have you got any parting words for somebody, that's probably, I don't know if you guys have sixth form or college, and well, college is different in it on your side. Who's thinking, I want to go to university and I'm doing my master's probably, or my undergraduate, and I want to go into a similar field as Robyn, but I feel I would not get the support from my family, and I'm finding it challenging because they've always been there for me. But I do want to stand firm and say, this is what I want to do. And I'm really passionate. But they're saying you won't get a job when you finish because you're brown, for example. Go and do this instead. That will ensure that you've got a brighter future ahead. Take it from there.
Yes, I mean, wow, what a deep and triggering question, because I definitely, can relate in some ways. I think for me, it was a long and tumultuous road to be able to make it into an academic program. As I mentioned before, I grew up in a low-income community. I grew up in a family that did not have therapists when I was growing up, or psychologists. And so really a lot of that work was me doing my own individual research at first, because while my family was supportive, they didn't necessarily know the paths that I would have to take and how difficult it would be. For me, a couple of important things that I did was that after I graduated with my undergrad degree, I waited a while. I went and I worked full time. I saved money. I got some life experiences so that when I made the decision to pursue a PhD, I was coming from a well-informed place and a place where I felt prepared to make that kind of life change. Because I'll tell you, it can be difficult. There may be, situations in which you don't necessarily know how to navigate academia, especially as someone who comes from an underserved community. So things that have been really affirming for me have been to reach out to mentorship from other people who have been through the process, to reach out and to make colleagues and to network with others so that you can build your own support system. It doesn't necessarily have to be in your family and friends. I think it's important to have boundaries between the two. But when you find and you're able to build a community with others who are also passionate about the work that you do, that will really give you the strength that you need to be able to make it through. So if you're the first in your family to do it, that's okay. Somebody has to be the first, like just believe in yourself and know that the reasons that you are pursuing the work that you're doing they're good reasons. You're coming from a place of passion, you're coming from a place of care, And we need more passionate and caring people in research because some people don't. And so I think, you know, people with lived experiences who want to do work on communities who they're really passionate about, just go for it. And I have really enjoyed being in a program and being able to mentor and help other people who have not made it yet, but are really passionate about that work. And I usually just tell them the same thing, you know, like build community, ensure that you're making an informed decision, and don't be afraid to reach out for support because you can do it.
Wow, you can do it. I've got one more question. You know, you've touched on, you know, your network and how they've got you right now. So I'm just thinking, if they're also thinking, when I need a supervisor or when I potentially get a supervisor, do I find somebody that's of the same gender as me, skin color as me, since I'm green and I need that support and I need that cuddle, or it doesn't matter, you know, go for it and, you know, look at their publications, see if it's something that you're passionate about, and if they've got a scholarship for what you're looking for, go for it, go for an interview, or stay in your comfort zone and look for, you know, what you've been told would work. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, I think that when it comes to affirming mentorship, you should really go where you feel seen and where you feel appreciated. Okay. And that is not always going to be with someone who comes from a similar background as you, someone who's the same skin tone as you, someone who's the same gender as you. Sometimes it is, and that can be really affirming in its own really beautiful ways to see someone who comes from a similar background as you and is able to have accomplished what you're interested in. But it can also come from places that might surprise you. I've had mentors who come from very different walks of life than I have that have taught me wonderful things. And we do share some things like our passion for research, our passion for mental health care. We may not come from the same community, but I also think diversity of thought can be a really beautiful thing. I think you should just go where you feel appreciated. I think that's the most important thing. Go where you feel comfortable and where you feel appreciated and affirmed, and where you feel like you can grow. And where that comes from might surprise you, but really the most important thing is that whoever is mentoring you or supervising you respects you as who you are in all of your identities, and works to get you where you want to go in your career.
Amazing words. Thank you so much. So basically, to summarize what you've said, because I think it's beautiful, you know, your career is not weighted on, you know, height, religion, you know, gender, color of the eyes or hair. It's just appreciation, respect, kindness, and having a similar vision, basically, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Where that comes from can vary widely. And you may come across multiple people who do that for you in various ways. So I also think, you know, expand on the idea that you only just have to have one mentor, one supervisor, one person in your community. You should have a team. You deserve a team of support. And that's how we're going to get through all of this, right? All of this craziness is to have people from different walks of life who affirm us and respect us and help us to get where we need to go.
Okay, I can say I have a friend in Robyn, so that's my network.
Yes.
But thank you so much for your time today. I believe I've learned so much, and you know, I've seen the world of you know, having equity in culture, in a sense, even though you didn't touch on it. But you know, I sense that, and I feel your work has so much potential in the sense of there's so much to touch on. So if you want to do it for 20 years, literally, you've got so much to do there. So I am really excited for you.
Thank you so much.
Perfect. So good luck, and hopefully second year, third year, fourth year, we'll have a conversation, and you know, we can discuss your progress, because I'm really excited. The fact that you work with numbers and you still deal with words, I think it's a thing. It's a big thing. I struggle, so Good on you.
Huge. And thank you so much for inviting me to talk. I think that your program is amazing. I've learned a lot just from watching you connect with other people, and I would love to come back and talk more because I think we need so much more of this, especially on a global scale. So I've had a wonderful time and I appreciate it, Noma.
Thank you.